All right, here we go with chapter 15. In chapter 15, we are going to talk about the digestive system. And this first slide here just kind of gives you an idea of how different systems work together. Some of the things that we've talked about along the way. Because not every major organ system has a major function, but those major functions can function alongside of other systems, like nutrients from the digestive system here make their way into the cardiovascular system where blood is located, and those nutrients are pumped all over the body at the same time and into cells, and then cells are producing waste and carbon dioxide and getting rid of them through the respiratory system and the urinary system. So there's digestive system, respiratory system, cardiovascular system, urinary system that all work together to accomplish a goal of maintaining a healthy body. The digestive system specifically is composed of a tract, so basically one long tube, like the respiratory tract is one long tube from the point where you breathe air in to the point where you get to the lungs, or that air gets to the lungs. The urinary tract is a long tube from the point at which urine is produced to the point where it's excreted. Same thing with the digestive system. From the time you eat food to the time waste is excreted, you're one long tube. The digestive tract, or the gastrointestinal or GI tract, is a muscular tube lined with a mucous membrane. And that mucous membrane secretes mucus. Again, we talked in the respiratory system about mucus trapping pathogens, which can happen here in the digestive system as well. But that mucus and the muscular or the mucus epithelial tissue is there to protect against abrasion. And that begins at the mouth and passes all the way through the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine. So this is the long tract, the one long tube from esophagus to the very distal end of the small intestine. Basically, you're open from on one end of the tube and on the other end of the tube, which is crazy, right? You can think about the fact that you can put food in your mouth. On the other end of the digestive tract, is the other opening. And then along the way, food makes its way through the esophagus, the stomach, small and large intestine, and changes. And as that changes, nutrients and electrolytes are absorbed, and anything that you don't need is excreted. But there's also, along the way, accessory organs that secrete products into the digestive tract to change that food and to remove nutrients from that food along the way. We'll talk about all of those organs and all the accessory organs. So we'll start in the oral cavity and talk a little bit about the tongue and teeth and some of the glands there, the salivary glands that secrete saliva and what that saliva has. The esophagus, the stomach, the small and the large intestine, and right here's the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder. So those are all accessory organs. The pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and salivary glands are the accessory organs to this tract, this one long tube. It's accomplishing a goal of digesting and absorbing food, digesting food to absorb nutrients in it. And there's four major layers. The mucosa, which is the innermost lining that lines the passageway or the lumen throughout the digestive tract. And the mucous membrane of the epithelium is moistened by glandular secretions. So the mucosa is made up of a thick layer of epithelial tissue bound to connective tissue, anchored to connective tissue deep to that epithelial tissue. It's called the lamina propria, and it's areolar connective tissue. That's loose connective tissue that we looked at back in the very first unit of class when we talked about tissues. And the epithelial tissue that's located along the layers of the digestive, or along the different sections of the digestive tract, like the esophagus, the small and large intestine, and the stomach, the epithelial tissue isn't always the same. It depends on what the need is in that particular organ. So we'll talk about that as we go. The submucosa is under the mucosa, so think sub is deep to or under the mucosa, which is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue, so more connective tissue, but that connective tissue holds blood vessels and lymphatics, which are part of the lymph system, the vessels of the lymphatic system, but also exocrine glands that secrete buffers and enzymes into the lumen, the passageway through the digestive tract, right? You guys Mucosa, submucosa, and then a thick layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis externa. And it's actually made of two layers, a longitudinal layer and a circular layer. And that longitudinal circular layer of muscle helps move food along the digestive tract. So think about swallowing. When you swallow the esophagus, if you swallow a large amount of food all at once, you can feel that actually move down your esophagus until it hits a certain point. There's smooth muscle there that is contracting and basically squishing food forward. And then the serosa is the outermost layer, but it's a layer of, it's a serous membrane. So we've talked about serous membranes that line the heart. That's called pericardium. We've talked about serous membranes that line the lungs. They're called pleura. Well, the third type of serous membrane in your body is called peritoneum, and it's found along the digestive tract in the peritoneal cavity, which is that creates the part of the peritoneal cavity. So these peritoneal membranes surround and line the digestive system organs to keep them safe and protected as things move around. There is no serosa in the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the rectum. So every other organ, like the stomach, small and large intestine, the liver, the pancreas, gallbladder, those organs all have this serosal layer, the visceral peritoneum. So here's what it looks like. This is maybe a cross section of the small intestine, call it. Right here, so from my cursor where you see these bumps to that little pink layer right there is the mucosa. So there's epithelial tissue that lines, this is the passageway through the digestive system, the lumen. A lumen is a passageway through something, like you have a lumen of blood vessels or a lumen of the small and large intestine or the lumen of the trachea. So the mucosa is the innermost layer that basically faces the lumen. The submucosa is deep to that, where there's a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. And then there's a muscularis externa. Remember I said there was a circular layer that's the innermost and a longitudinal layer that runs along the digestive tract, right, this way. And then the outermost layer is the serosa, which is the visceral peritoneum. They are also called mesenteric linings. So if you think mesenteries are the layers of serous membranes that surround the digestive system organs. And if they line the organ, if they are connected to the organ directly, it's visceral peritoneum. Once that visceral peritoneum leaves the organ and lines the body cavity, it's parietal peritoneum. So we've talked about visceral and parietal pleura and the visceral and parietal pericardium. There's visceral and parietal peritoneum. That is the third type of serous membrane. So in the mucosa, there's some really important structures that are critical to the function of the organs of the digestive system. There's two different types. Again, remember in the mucosa, I said there's a mucosal epithelium, and that epithelium can change depending on the need of the organ. Well, in the oral cavity and the pharynx and in your esophagus, your food tube, there's stratified squamous epithelium. Think about it. You're chewing food. It may be sharp and cause abrasion, or it may need to be broken down. Like if you think you eat like a cracker that can kind of has rough edges. Those rough edges can abrase the inside of your mouth or your throat, which is your pharynx, or your esophagus. Or if you've ever swallowed a really big chunk of food and it almost feels like it's cutting your throat on the way down, that stratified squamous epithelium there is there to protect against abrasion as you chew and move food around that upper part of the digestive system. Well, that's chewing, and the mechanical mashing of food happens in the oral cavity, the pharynx, and the esophagus. So by the time you hit the stomach, small and large intestine, that's not as much of a concern. But what does need to happen there is secretion of enzymes that can break down the food chemically, not just mechanically, and then absorption of nutrients in the small and the large intestine. So where that occurs in those three major organs, you have simple columnar epithelium in the mucosa. And the function of simple columnar epithelium is to secrete and absorb. So wouldn't that make sense to have that functional cell type, that epithelial tissue there located in those organs, so that those organs can do that job? So the job of the organ is really being undertaken by the epithelial tissue. So the simple columnar epithelium is able to absorb nutrients depending on what transporters are located in the epithelial tissue cells, and facilitate the secretion of things like mucus and the digestive system enzymes that help break down food and help those organs absorb nutrients. Well, to do that, the epithelial cells are lining villi. So there's folds in the digestive system, and those folds are called, one fold is a villus. So if I'm going to flip back here, like this is a villus, right? So this bump here, as I flip forward, is a villus, and there's basically a mucosal projection that increases surface area to maximize absorption of nutrients. Well, on one villus, back to that slide again, right? Here's one villus. Well, there's simple columnar, right? Actually, these little bumps are villi, those little tiny bumps. So this larger bump is called a plicae circularis. We'll talk about what that is. The little tiny bumps are villi, and even on villi, you have epithelial cells that line the villi, and those villi with epithelial cells lining them, the epithelial cells themselves have microvilli. Well, that was my dog's going crazy. So we'll get back to where we left off, talking about mucosal components. The lamina, we were just talking about villi that increase surface area for absorption, and villi are lined with the epithelial tissue, so simple columnar epithelium. And then simple columnar epithelium also has a layer of microvilli, all to increase surface area to maximize absorption in the intestine. The lamina propria is a layer of connective tissue that the epithelium is anchored to by the basement membrane, which contains blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. And then the muscularis mucosa is a third layer in the mucosa that's just two thin layers of smooth muscle that move the circular folds in the villi in the mucosal layer. So take a look at this. If this little tiny small section, I said at one of these bigger bumps was called a plicae circularis, circular folds. So that's what this big structure is. Right here, each one of these bumps is a villus. These are all villi lined with epithelial cells, so simple columnar epithelium, that have microvilli. So this is the mucosal epithelium here. The lamina propria is this layer here of areolar connective tissue. And then the muscularis mucosa is this muscular layer that helps move the folds, these big plicae circularis in the digestive system. And there's submucosa deep to that. And then there's the muscularis externa, those three major layers. And the mucosa specifically itself has three layers as well. Within the submucosa and the muscularis externa, there's two nerve plexuses. And a nerve plexus is basically just a intertwined network of nerves that innervates particular areas. So innervating the mucosa and submucosa is the submucosal plexus. It's located in the submucosa. Some of the extensions of neurons make their way into the mucosal layer as well. And those are nerve networks of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves that increase digestive activity or decrease digestive activity depending on where the stimulus is coming from, whether it be parasympathetic or sympathetic. And if it's parasympathetic stimulation, that increases digestive activity. Think the parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest, right? So when you activate that system, it increases activity, whereas sympathetic stimulation inhibits activity by relaxing the muscles there. The myenteric plexus is located between the two layers of muscle, the circular and longitudinal layers, in the muscularis externa. So these layers of muscle are so important for a couple of reasons. Peristalsis is basically the movement of a bolus a section of food along the digestive tract. So basically, food enters the digestive tract as a bolus, this kind of ball of food. And the bolus is propelled forward along the digestive tract by the muscularis externa, the circular and longitudinal layers. And that process of sequential contraction, we'll show you on the next slide here, is called peristalsis. So here's what happens. So food is moving from mouth on this side where the number is into eventually towards the other end of the digestive system, towards the anus. So the food is here. The muscle prior to that contracts, the circular muscle contracts and pinches down on that and moves food forward. The longitudinal layer of muscle pulls in the opposite direction, and that all propels food forward. So the circular and longitudinal layer of in the muscularis externa propel food. So think about this tube as like the esophagus. The circular layer decreases the size of the lumen and pushes that food forward. And then the longitudinal layer contracts and shortens and helps the circular layer propel that food forward. Segmentation is a little bit different than peristalsis. So think peristalsis is just the movement of a bolus of food forward in the digestive tract. There's also a series of contractions that can mix and churn and fragment the bolus. Well, that's called segmentation. So think about segmenting something, breaking it into pieces. That mixes materials with intestinal secretions. So as opposed to peristalsis, which is the movement of food forward in the digestive system, this then fragments the food, mixes it, and churns it. So it helps mechanically digest this food, break it down physically. And that occurs in the small intestine and parts of the large intestine, whereas peristalsis occurs in like the esophagus and all along the digestive tract. So here's segmentation. So the circular muscle pinches in and separates the bolus of food into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks, so that as it moves along the digestive system by way of peristalsis, that segmentation can then take smaller and smaller pieces of that bolus and allow it to mix thoroughly with the digestive enzymes along the way. So that's it for the beginning of the digestive system. The next section is a little bit longer because we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the actual system, but this was an introduction of kind of the whole system itself. We'll get into the specific functions of each of the organs as we go. So I will see you soon.